Welcome to the show. Huge pleasure to have you. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, Akash. Pleasure to be here as well.
Pleasure is
My name is Kajal Tyagi. I am a counseling psychologist and a behavior therapist. I
mm-hmm.
have a private practice. I virtually see clients. The name of my practice is Self Unwind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I see adolescents and adults and couples virtually.
Okay,
So, yeah, that's yeah.
right. So we are going to talk about the need for a therapist to get therapy. So I'll just get right
Mm-hmm.
down to it. Why do you feel it is essential for a therapist to get therapy for themselves before starting a practice?
Mm-hmm. um Before studying the practice as well as throughout the practice as well, like I want to clear that it's not just that the therapist is required to go
Mm-hmm.
into therapy just before they start. And There are two reasons for it,
Mm-hmm.
and both of them are interrelated. So firstly, I'll talk about the therapist being a human, having a background, having their own
Good point.
trauma, having
Yeah,
yeah, having
yeah.
their own trauma, their own conditioning, their own set of beliefs, their cultural biases. So firstly, the therapist needs to be in therapy, the trainee
Mm-hmm.
therapist needs to be in therapy, so as to get familiar with their own dark side, as we
Mm-hmm.
all have it.
Mm-hmm.
Our own existential and neurotic issues, our
Mm-hmm.
own needs and desires, um, are, like I said, trauma as well. So first
Mm-hmm.
is that, to be, and that also works. Like, why I said it's interrelated is because it then affects how you are as a therapist as well, your own issues, because they're also revisited a lot when you meet clients who have similar issues or even different, like opposing issues.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that the therapist first needs to be aware about, which
Mm-hmm.
happens in therapy, simultaneously keep working on it. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not possible that you work through all of your issues before you become a therapist, because then a newer issues also come into your life. Like, life never stops being challenging. So but continuous work on your own issues. And then the second point, which is, therapists biggest instrument in therapy is their own self.
Mm-hmm.
And in order for a therapist to use their feelings as guide points in therapy with their clients, and to use their own self, they first need to be aware about their
Mm-hmm.
own feelings, and make sure that their feelings are reliable. Are they influenced by their own past stuff?
Right.
So all of the things are necessary to be processed in therapy. And
Mm-hmm.
then being in therapy, exploring the existential and neurotic issues yourself, broadens your understanding of those issues, so that you can then take that understanding and apply
Mm-hmm.
it to your clients and what they are facing. And then also, one of the most important thing is to have that frame of reference of a client,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when we begin to become therapist, we are, there's a hierarchy, that I'm a therapist and then I'm meeting a client. But when you actually are a client throughout, you understand what a client goes through, how a client
Right.
feels before they come to a therapy session, right? How do they look at their therapist, their need for dependence, sometimes their need for appreciation from the therapist,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how does the therapeutic relationship feels. So all of the things, all of the feelings that a client goes through, if you know that as a therapist, it makes you more understanding of their position.
Uh,
It brings empathy in a very organic way, because you have been there, you know how it
right.
feels to be a client. And I think the hierarchies that are there kind of comes down when you are a client yourself. And you
Does it?
also see how
Yeah.
what yeah, go ahead.
No, go on. What were you saying?
It's all right. Yeah, it's all
Right.
right, you can ask.
Does it ease the burden for the client to know that their therapist has undergone therapy themselves?
I think it does. I mean, I am seeing it from a client's perspective. I would be comfortable if I knew that my therapist is going to therapy themselves. Right? Like, if I'm a client and I get to know that my therapist has never been to therapy, they've never felt what I'm feeling on this side of the couch. I think I would want my therapist to be in therapy. And I think when I tell my clients that, because they're seeing you as superhumans or people
Yes.
who are not
Yes.
having challenges.
Yes.
Yeah, so when you tell a client that, I have also been to therapy, and or when a client says that, thank you for saying that, and I'm able to say that I relate with you, because when my therapist says that to me or appreciates me, it feels amazing. So I think, like I said, you come down onto almost the same level, and that is the level of being a human. And I
Mhm.
think it definitely helps. I would feel comfortable if my therapist goes to therapy and communicates that to me.
Hmm. And what is countertransference?
Mhm. So, as like it's very popular, transference and counter-transference. Transference is when a client projects their unresolved conflicts and feelings onto the therapist, and similarly, the therapist can project their unmet or unresolved conflicts or feelings onto their client. So that is the process of counter-transference, and it's almost inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
More and more people are now realizing, like in Freud's time, it was something seen as in a very negative light. Now more and more people are realizing that it is something that is inevitable,
Mm-hmm.
and it is something that that the therapist needs to be aware about, and use, instead of thinking of it as something totally negative.
Could you give an example of countertransference?
Yeah. Yeah, so for example, I'll give you both positive countertransference and negative, in the sense that when a therapist is feeling for the
Mm-hmm.
client, or the
Mm-hmm.
therapist is able to relate with the client, in the sense that the therapist has himself or herself gone through what the client is going through. So, because the unresolved feelings of the therapist related to the same issue surface in the session, the therapist can be overcompensating or over self disclosing. They can disclose
Mm-hmm.
too much about their own issue. And the client does not need that at that time. The client does not need to hear that maybe it was worse for you, or that it can get worse, even
Yes.
worse than their situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one example of actually positive and why I say positive is, you're feeling too much empathy or compassion, and that kind of hampers the process.
Okay.
And a negative one could be
Mm-hmm.
that your client has a belief that is not congruent to what you believe, and you become overcritical of the client, or you tell them that this is a wrong belief, or this is a wrong perception, and that would create more distance between you and your client. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not actually about the client, it's about you as a therapist. It's about your belief which is coming into the therapeutic relationship.
Right.
So these are the two examples, and both, like the therapist needs to be aware when,
Mm-hmm.
and both can happen, like we're humans, two
Right.
humans interacting. It can never be objective, but being aware is something that always helps. And like I said, in the positive scenario where you know that you're feeling so much for the client, how much do you self disclose so that the client takes away from your experience, and your experience actually helps the clients, instead of, like, you can use your experience, you can use the self disclosure to work for the therapeutic relationship if you're aware about it. So you can use counter transference to the benefit of the therapeutic
Mm-hmm.
relationship. And my supervisor always says that it's something that happens all the time, in small ways and in big ways. Counter transference is always happening, you just have to know how it is happening.
Right. And how can negative countertransference, impact the therapeutic goal?
Hmm. Like I said, the client can feel distanced. The
Mm-hmm.
client can feel attacked.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you are experiencing something and you're talking so much about your perspective, the client can feel that you've taken up all the space in the therapeutic session, that it's actually become about you and not them. And just, the empathy goes out of the picture because it becomes so much about you. So the
Mm-hmm.
therapeutic relationship is really impacted when that happens. The client begins to see you as someone who's too caught up with themselves, and that creates holes in the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So, what are some of the emotional problems that are faced by the therapist?
Hmm. So definitely, this is quite understood that this field is very emotionally and mentally demanding. It psychologically impacts the therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, the therapist can be forced to revisit their own trauma, their own difficult memories, if it is something that the client is also facing something similar. So, like the revisiting of the difficult things, which can impact the therapist. Another emotional problem is to continuously be exposed to trauma and the consequences of trauma, the suffering, and it can impact the therapist meaning making of life, or the therapist's hope in goodness or in human strength. It can impact that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is when you're continuously exposed to trauma or to the suffering of humans. So that is something that can take a toll on a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so these are the emotional problems that a therapist faces in the profession.
So, how can personal issues such as loss of a loved one or divorce or any
Hmm.
other issue impact their therapeutic performance?
Hmm. So, like you're saying, these life stresses impact us in a lot of ways,
Mm-hmm.
right? Loss of a loved one, like grief, takes its own time to be processed. Um, it can deprive the therapist of um, being stable. Like, when we go through these life stressors, it's not that we can be stable all throughout. Even if we are a therapist, even if we know how to deal with them, these are challenges that need time to be healed. And when we are physically, mentally, emotionally not stable or not our best selves, it we don't have the energy to be there for
Mm-hmm.
someone the same in the same manner. And because we're mentally and emotionally so compromised, it impacts the work that we do, because
Right.
again, it's emotional work, it's the work of compassion. So I think that it impacts the person and the therapist very immensely, and that is why the need of therapy comes into picture, and the need to take break also. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you are compromised, you will not do any good taking a therapy session, because you won't be able to be there. You're with yourself so much, you won't be able to be there with your client.
Right. And I think the therapist may also lose the objectivity that is required for a good session.
Yeah, for sure. Like, yeah, they can be too involved with themselves, their own grief, their own stressors, their own problems. Like, it's not possible for the therapist is human at the end of the day. They
Right.
can't switch off and sit there. Like, that happens because everyday issues are
Mm-hmm.
there, but when life stressors such as losing someone or a divorce, like something so intense is happening, it's difficult, it's next to impossible to switch it off and sit with the client.
What is
Yeah.
compassion fatigue and how can a therapist deal with that?
Hmm. So I think it's also commonly known as empathy fatigue, and many people believe that that is a better term because, like many people believe, and I believe the same, that
Mm-hmm.
there can't be too much compassion. Your desire to elevate suffering or help someone through suffering can't be too much. It's the empathy that can be too much, and that's when it's happening without boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so common because people in this field are actually empaths and people who are very very sensitive to suffering, which is why they choose, they're so passionate for it, that it's very easy to lose those boundaries.
Right.
It's very easy to want to be there for your client or for
Mm-hmm.
people who are suffering so much at your own expense.
Mm-hmm.
So, compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue, whatever we call it, is the emotional residue that continues to be there with you because you are being exposed to suffering, you're being exposed to the consequences of trauma. And it's different than burnout. Like, many people confuse it with burnout or say that it's used
Mm-hmm.
interchangeably, but it's not. Burnout is most about occupation, about workload, about institutional stress.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and empathy fatigue is more about the emotional residue because of being there and witnessing suffering and wanting to help, right? So
Right.
that is what is empathy fatigue, and it can impact the therapist quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens, like I said, because most therapists are empaths. They
Mm-hmm.
try to be there for the client at their own expense. It can impact emotionally for sure, emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, not being able to be there for your loved ones in your personal life, not
Mm-hmm.
being able to balance personal and professional life, not being able to switch off from the therapist stance, thinking about the clients throughout the day, worrying about the clients.
Right.
So those are the, and then of course the emotional distress then transfers to physical distress as well. So headaches and depression as well could be there if it's not addressed.
Right. And how can it be
Yeah.
handled?
I think first is to be aware of
Right.
of the situations that trigger you to have that empathy which is gone beyond the boundary. Like there are some issues which are more personal to every person. There are some issues that I know I am very sensitive about because it's also something that I go through. So that is
Mhm.
when my
Right.
boundaries can take a toll, and my boundaries are out of question. So first is self awareness. Second is to have a mindfulness practice always,
Mhm.
in whatever way you can. I'm not saying just
Mhm.
meditation, but mindfulness in any way, because mindfulness, like, it's proven that it helps us
Yes, it does.
become better emotional regulators, right? So it impacts our brain chemistry, and it helps us have better emotional regulation. So
Mhm.
mindfulness, and in that moment, if mindfulness and self-awareness, they both go hand in hand. So if you sit down to meditate, you will know many things that you were not addressing throughout the day. So, and then taking self-care, basically taking all of the things that you tell your client very seriously and applying them to yourself, no matter, like, you get reminded of them in the session, but many times we ignore them even as therapists because we have
Mhm.
so many tasks and work comes in between. But boundaries, we teach our clients boundaries all the time. So having those boundaries, we teach our clients to have a solid self-care routine, so that to be able to have habits, and exercises or activities that we love, that we enjoy doing just for the sake of it. So
Mhm.
we have something outside of work as well, right?
Well,
Taking feedback from others.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think another very important point is to
Mhm.
set realistic expectations,
Right.
to not
Right.
expect yourself to be there for the client at all times, because
Mhm.
guilt is something that can come in for the therapist. Like, if I am not able to take a session today for a client for any reason, and the client, whoever's coming to you, is suffering more or less, and then there's this guilt that can carry forward, that I was not able to be there for this client. But then if you can't pour from an empty cup, so you have to take care of your needs, of your schedule, of what you owe to yourself also, as
Mhm.
you take care of your clients. So set your realistic expectations. You won't be able to be there for all clients at all times,
Right.
right? There's
Right.
only so much you can do as a person.
Right.
And then I think another thing that I've recently realized that I want to put out is to have faith in your client's strength. Like, a lot of the times we feel that, because they are compromised, we worry for them. But after a session or two sessions, they'll come up and tell you something that you did not actually think they would do. Like, they went for a meditation retreat, or they went and got a gym membership for themselves. Like, you think that they're too compromised to do that, but even they have that strength within them. So believe in every person's strength, believe in your client's strength, so that you can take a back seat and you don't feel like you have to do all the work for them.
So when multiple clients come to you with multiple different issues, most of them involving negative thoughts, how difficult is it to shield yourself from getting influenced by those thoughts?
Hmm. It's a good question. Um, I think first is, like, the empathy gets triggered because
Mhm.
it's not just them, you think negatively too.
Right.
So it's the empathy that we are so conditioned to think negatively about something than positively. So
Mhm.
you get reminded that this is something that not just happens with them, but it happens with you as well. But because as a therapist you are looking from outside, it's not
Mhm.
your situation, it's their situation. You have an outsider perspective, you have the therapist stance. So it's relatively easy when someone's talking about
Mhm.
their perception and their negative thought patterns. It's relatively easy for you to maintain that distance as a therapist and to stay in that stance.
Right.
And meditation above all helps me do that, like when it's happening with me as well.
Mhm.
uh Meditation is something that helps me redirect.
Right. What is your specialization and how can one contact you?
Okay, so like I said, I'm a counseling psychologist, so I deal with
Mhm.
mild to moderate issues. um and some of my specialization, like the areas that I work with, are work life balance, relationship stress, relationship or couples therapy, stress, anxiety, and issues related to anxiety, existential issues such as isolation, meaninglessness, death anxiety. So these are some of few areas that I work with. And you can reach out to me on my website. It's called selfunwind.com. And I go on Instagram by the same handle, selfunwind. And you can find my email ID on my website, and you can reach out to me through that.
Right. And the sessions would be virtual mostly.
Yeah, it's virtual.
Right.
I only take virtual sessions.
Right. Okay, what are some of the blind spots that a therapist may be facing when dealing with a client and how to deal with them?
Hmm. There can be a lot of them. Like, I will again say that because you're human, you come from your own background.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of blind spots. Some of them are, firstly, your own beliefs, your own conditioning, your own cultural stance.
Right.
Like if I'm working with someone who belongs to a different culture or a different background, then I need to be aware about my cultural blind spots or beliefs that may come and play a role in the therapeutic relationship, and may actually be quite opposite to my clients'
Mm-hmm.
beliefs and cultural dogmas. So one is that,
Mm-hmm.
and therapy helps because you realize what it is that you believe in. What are your perceptions? Are they helping you or are they pulling you back? So that is something that can be addressed in your personal therapy. um, there are technical blind spots as well.
Mm-hmm.
Many I've read this, I have experienced this, that many therapists think that insights giving insights to the client, because we've been trained to with all these theories and this understanding. So we want to always practice this intellectual exercising of figuring out what's happening with the client, and telling them that this is something that happening with you. And also the clients also appreciate that to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
They also want to know why. They Most of the clients come to you with the question, why is this happening to me? Like, make sense of it for me. I'm done trying.
Uh-huh.
So I think many therapists believe that insights is something that your clients appreciate the most. And
Mm-hmm.
I had that dogma as well. And when I went to therapy, like my personal therapy,
Mm-hmm.
and I got some insights during the first few sessions, and it gave me a high. It gave me a high that, okay, now I know
Really?
what's happening with me. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
it helped. Like, it made so much sense. Like, my when my therapist told me that, I think that this is something that is happening with you and this is why.
Uh-huh.
And it gave me the answers that I was looking for so long. And then also you look up to that information because it's coming from your therapist. But then after a few sessions I realized that empathy is something that I value more than insights.
Right.
Because if I'm getting insights but I feel like my therapist is not really there with me, she's not able to feel what I'm feeling, even though I know what is happening, but it comes with its own set of feelings and emotions. And if when I sensed that there was a bit of a difference in terms of emotions between me and my therapist, I retracted. I held myself back, and that is when I realized that my giving insight to my clients is something that is more important for me than for my clients, and I
And
need to balance it out.
right,
Yeah.
because it might also be because the client may not have the sufficient ego strength to accept the insight at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what about the generation gap between a therapist and a client? How can that impact therapy?
I think I would again say it would be about beliefs and perception, the difference
Mhm,
between beliefs and perceptions, and the
mhm,
objectivity and subjectivity more than the like you can see there are some people from the elder generation who are
mhm.
much more in tune with their beliefs. They're more self-aware, and they're
Right.
also more aware about the difference, the gap between the intellectual as well as the emotional upbringing of both
Mhm,
the generations. So because they're sensitive, they're able to keep that to themselves, like be self-aware and keep their own beliefs and not let it, interact with the therapeutic relationship.
mhm,
Whereas there are also people, like I have clients who have initially gone to people who were elder to them,
mhm.
and they felt misunderstood and they felt that they were not understood at all. So I think it depends person to person, and then it all comes down to how aware you are about your beliefs, about your cultural dogmas, about your perception about the world and life stressors. But it
Right.
also depends on clients. Some
Mhm,
clients give a pay attention to how old the therapist is. Some clients don't
mhm.
consider that, and they don't actually care.
Right.
I think it's very subjective.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kajal, for your insights. It was a lovely conversation that I had with you.
Same here, Akash. I am very passionate about talking about these things, so it was wonderful for me to be here. Thank you so
So,
much.
I'll stop the call.